LionFarm, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah. What I do is pretty much I like to look into some of the truth said in the Bible about basically the historical movements of the biblical Israelites and find out where they are today and looking into basically the genetic, the historic, the linguistic, and different information all around to try to come to a clear picture of what's going on in the world we're in.
Cool. So tell me what evidence you think there is, or tell me more generally, what do you think is the position of the Hebrew Israelites, and what is the evidence that supports that position?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things about when we think about things like people say Hebrew Israelism or the Black Hebrew Israelites or people who claim to be of Israelite descent, or even if we're going to say like something as simple as a Jew or Jewish. So there's a line from a genetic and someone claiming a birthright versus someone who is basically of faith or of a religion. Now, what I'm more reflecting when I say ancient Israel, a historical and a more genetic based um, group of individuals. And I believe that we do have evidence for that in a couple different articles that actually look into some of the PCA studies and some of the Y chromosome and mDNA of the Jews or who are claimed are Jews or some of the movements or places of Jews that are found. And I think we have a couple of those.
Well, what are you comparing it to? So, like, I imagine the claim is something like the original Hebrews or something that are mentioned from the Bible went to Africa or something. And that seems to be like the conclusion you're making. And there's some tribe that you're referring to. And so, if that's the case,
Yeah, well, let's look at the beginning. Like, for example, when we're talking about the people who are like genetic Israelites, we're talking about descendants that would come from him that left the Euphrates, areas of Euphrates, and he would have went down Syria, down the Levant, into areas of Africa, into Egypt. Now, his descendants, they would have kind of made a back and forth movement through Syria and Africa, back to Egypt. So it's important to know, like, they're going from Syria to Africa, Egypt, and then within hundreds of years, the descendants of the growth of these, basically, he has 12 sons from a certain woman named Sarah. And those 12 sons, long story short, to Egypt. They have hundreds of years of generations development in those areas of Africa, Egypt. They're also being sent down the Nile. We know this because there's certain verses of scripture that talk about when those Israelites are in Egypt, they're also being sent down the Nile. Now, there are different scholarly consensus of where that was. Some say it was in Thebes. If we're taking like, it depends if we're talking about New Kingdom or, you know, the changes of Egypt, because a lot of people, they differ between either if the Exodus was in the 1500s or if the Exodus was in the 1200s, which I more point to what they call a late Exodus, or some say an early Exodus. It depends on what their view of that is. But me personally, I find that we know that the Israelites were people that existed. They had popped up after the movements of pretty much some of the Semitic groups that went into the lands of Egypt. From my studies, a land called Avaris. So within the area of Avaris, there were Israelites, but then at a certain time frame, they left. Now, a lot of people say different things about who was the Exodus Pharaoh, but I believe that that Exodus Pharaoh was Ramses II. That is another subject to get into, but the most important thing is that by the time when the Israelites had went into the Levant, which we see are mentioned in tablets like the Merneptah Stele, they actually were seen to be there for a while into different events like the Bible talks about. They were taken captive, they were going through the land for a while, and then they were going back and forth through Egypt. Like, for example, one of the time of the kings, Solomon, and his basically rival in a way, Jeroboam, there was a separation where Rehoboam was going to become the next king and Jeroboam was going to be king of the northern tribes. But there was a time they went into Egypt. So when Solomon was ruling, some of the Israelites went into Egypt again, to Africa. Now, it was also interesting to note at that time that the Egyptians, the rulers, were moving into areas of Libya and stuff. So we also know that some of the earliest evidence of synagogues in Africa were in Africa. For example, one of the synagogues within 1000 BC in Libya, we have a lot of evidence of ancient Israelite presence in time frame. And we also have evidence of them in the Middle Ages by certain documents and certain writings. And I think that's what's the most important thing, is to look at the historical movement. As we know, the Israelites were a real people, but the question is, which way did they go in their exiles?
So could you be more specific about, like, when do you think there was somebody in Israel who you think moved down to Africa, and when did this happen? Who was it? What was the time period? And what specifically is your position, so we can try to understand it better?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. I'm going to kind of...
No, I can't hear you. I think you lost connection. How are you guys in the chat doing? Hey, Don, how's it going? Michael. Squid Super Hunk from Twitch chat. Appreciate the Twitch followers. We got like 5 people who follow on there. What's some more?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Were you able to hear me? Because on my phone, I don't know if I switch screens, if you can hear me or not.
No, you lost connection, so I couldn't hear you when you did that.
Okay. I'll basically explain what I was explaining, because I guess I can't switch screens. I'm gonna use another screen while I'm explaining. Basically, the explanation is, we actually know that in the writings of Jeremiah 40, we know that during the Babylonian exiles, we know that Nebuchadnezzar had basically persecuted the people for a while. And by the time of basically 586 BC, we know that Israelites were going down into Egypt. Now, even in the book of Jeremiah and in other writings of the early Testament, we know that as Israelites were going down into Egypt, they were fleeing more deeper into Africa, and they were being persecuted a little later. And there was a prophecy of a 40-year captivity that was going to happen when they go into Egypt. So they knew that it was going to happen. And as more went deeper and deeper in the time of, you could say about 2,500 years ago, right? Or 2,600 years ago, around that time, people started to go into the lands of Egypt. Now, I wanted to do this on my computer, but my boys had taken my charger, so my computer's dead. But I wanted to read something, a genetic article that actually talks about the study of Mizraim Jews with Jews of Iraq. And they found out in the study of their PCA, they have a deep ancestral connection to some of the Yoruba Bantu groups. And we're talking 2,600 years ago, that the PCA is showing that these groups are connected to some of these African groups, that these African groups actually show even genetic connections up to 3,200 years ago in some of the ancient Jews that are said to be banished to areas of pretty much lens of media and Babylon, which is really interesting because when you take some of the studies, we're talking not obviously take these things as a grain of salt. That's why we take hours on my channel. We take hours looking into the actual genetic results and studies, and we find out that early Jews did show that they had a ancestral connection to said groups that would be considered African. So what I'm discussing is basically this African admixture was early in the Jews.
Sure. Why is that surprising? Like any group usually has genetic mixtures with every other group around it to some degree. So why is that surprising?
Exactly. And that's the point. Is that why is that surprising? But the point is, a lot of people, when you see studies of Jews now, for example, the Ashkenazim, which is a middle-aged culture mix, which if we go back to the bottleneck during 1,200 years ago, they had an Indo-European mix. Well, that was the largest growing population of Jews, but they had this new modern Indo-European mix. And also we know that during that time, there was a mass conversion that had happened. But the problem is that the original ancient Jews originally had an African admixture, not a recent African admixture, but an ancient African admixture. But the recent Jews have a middle-aged Indo-European mixture. So the interesting thing is that the ancient Jews may have been more of that African component first, and later had received some of that Indo-European admixture.
Well, we're all from Africa. Like the further you go back, the more African everybody becomes because we're all from Africa.
Well, a majority, from looking at fossils, when we're considering we're all from Africa, what are you talking about specifically? Are you saying that we all root to an African atom, or are you saying that our haplogroups would trace to Africa? Because, for example, if your haplogroup is I, a haplogroup of I, you've never been to Africa, right? If we're talking about from your node, right, from the clade, all the clade of I would have been in Europe, right? We could trace that all the way back to like the recent bottleneck of the Neolithic, or the banishment of the Arctic humans, or archaic humans like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, right? So when we're talking about modern humans, we're talking about a separation of basically the node that splits into different clades. And these clades are all separate into almost a different family stock from what we can see from what is called a star graph or unrooted chart, right? So from the root, all lines diverge, and we find evidence, just like how we see in the Bible, there was a global mass extinction and a genetic bottleneck, showing that all men would trace to one node, so one ultimate male line, which wouldn't actually be Adam, but would be a genetic CT, or you can look it up. It's called a genetic CT, or the haplogroup CT, which is a root node that makes all the lineages afterwards. So yeah, we would technically, yes, if we go all the way deep into ancient roots, we all would link to one ultimate man. But when I'm talking modern humans, as all humans today are modern humans, right? We're talking about a genetic selection that was made of a certain group.
I don't see what I don't see this, like the significance of what you're saying and how it's different from just what we already believe about genetics in Israel and Africa and how they related. I don't see what is the importance of saying that yes, there is genetic lineages where people passed genes in different groups nearby. Therefore, what?
What I'm saying is, just like when the scripture says, out of all the heritage of the world, out of all the heritage of Adam, God chose Israel. And we know that because there's a verse in Genesis that says, out of all the heritages, right? Is that he chose Israel. And the reason why that's important, because out of Israel will come the rising of a later Messiah that will save the whole world. Now, the illustration of that was because we had to first go through the historical understanding of who is Israel and why the world needs to be saved. Because if we look at ancient culture, there's no doubt that like even the Tufian culture that showed that they went down into Africa and started to pretty much torment even pregnant women and stuff like that. We're talking ancient Mesolithic, Paleolithic cultures of ancient humans that were tormenting people. And since the time, the dawn of ancient humans, right? Neanderthals, Denisovans, they've been killing each other for a long time. Modern humans, ancient humans,
Wait, so
all types of humans.
just to like rephrase what you said. So the reason it matters is because the Israelites were chosen by God, and so one of the descendants of the Israelites is supposed to be the Messiah, and therefore it's important to know which lineages are descendants of Israel to guess which ones the Messiah could potentially come from. Is that essentially it?
Well, the great thing is that we don't have to go through that complex process now, because for us to find that now, yeah, we have to use tools like historical connections, genetic connections, right? But one of the best things that we can use is ancient history. Is that when the Israelites were rising, they were rising up around the areas of Levant and areas of Africa where we know Egypt was, and of areas of Babylon. So we know that they was all around the Middle East, around that area. But what happened is that God chose a people that he was going to illustrate how he wanted people to be, he wanted them to be structured people. But he knew that as people are, they will constantly show these constant flaws. So the scripture, it writes almost like a biography of the witness of life. Like we can verify almost every king, every ruler in the Bible in their exact time living, and in many times addressing certain kings like Jehu, and certain kings of the northern tribes that are verified by other kings in
Well,
actual stealers.
I'm pretty familiar with the Bible. The first confirmed king is David. Everyone before that is not confirmed. But more interested in like specifically you're claiming that God picked a people, and when did he pick his people? What is the date? And then all of the people who are in that group from that date have a lineage.
We're talking
and we can
Bronze Age,
measure
a Bronze Age
Bronze
culture. That's what we're talking about. Bronze Age culture.
So the Bronze Age Israelites or the Bronze Age Hebrews, all of their descendants would be of this particular lineage, right?
Yeah, so when a certain male was selected, and now this was interesting. This is why we got to look at Y chromosome, because it was a certain male that was selected. Now, this means that this male, his line already existed, but he was selected. His name was Abraham, and he was selected, and it was said that from his descendants would rise a descendant that would actually many people. Now, the story is that as the story progressed all the way to the Iron Age, right, the time of the kings, until the time of the transition to the Middle Age, when Christ comes in. So Christ comes in obviously at the transition when we see AD BC time frame. And or some people say, BC's CE time frame. He comes in, right, and he's the fulfillment to many other sayings of old. But we have to understand what he even says, right? In Luke, he illustrates that because the people rejected him, is that as we know, the Messiah had to come to the temple. One of the prophecies of old said the temple had to stand there, which we know historically the temple was there before 70 AD. Messiah, and we know Christians were there before 70 AD. And we know that Messiah prophesied that the people was going to go into captivity into all nations again. Now, we know that many people went to captivity in all nations, but the interesting thing is the illustration of the people chosen that would be the people of God, that would be sent into captivity of all the nations. The reason why that's important is because he also prophesied of a gathering of them in Acts 1, 6, and 7, where he says that the Father will gather them in a time to come. And it's interesting because all of Christ are waiting for a time to come, but he also leaves the people, the ancient people, almost on a suspense that they're also waiting for a time to come, but they're on another captivity.
Trying to go like one step at a time here. So you're saying that the true Israelites, the ones chosen by God, are all the lineage of Abraham. The other Hebrews at the time don't count. It's only the lineage of Abraham. And so the significant group that you're trying to identify is all of the descendants of Abraham that exist today. All of those are the true Israelites, right?
Yeah, so what I'm discussing, what I'm saying is that the descendants of the bloodline of Abraham, of his direct like bloodline descendants, would be from a certain Y chromosome group, which I think
Right,
would actually be more.
and those are the true Israelites. That's what you're looking for. True
Yes,
Israelites are all the direct lineage of Abraham.
yes, and there would also be a mixed multitude that would also take part later in the time of Egypt during the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. There will also be a mixed multitude during the Exodus that becomes with them. And there's a law in the Bible that says that the Edomite and the Egyptian in the third generation will become one with them.
So who would not be a true Israelite at this point? So given that the Bronze Age is 3000 BC to like 1000 BC, so that's like 5,000 years ago ish, and if Abraham existed then, and if I don't think he did, I think he's a mythical character, but if he existed and had children, and there was some kind of a lineage that was formed, kind of like Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun or whatever, that lineage would span a large portion of the planet. Like it would go into Africa and it would go into Europe and it would go into India. Like there would be a huge population that would be related to this guy. So I imagine about a quarter of the world would be related to this guy at this point.
A time frame, you got to be careful of the time frame when he does, like he doesn't go into Europe. None of his lineage goes into Europe. No time before the Iron Age. That's one of the biggest things about his lineage. The reason why we know that, because we can follow his lineage through the scripture. He and his sons go to Syria, and then they go down into the Levant. They go down into Egypt, Africa. They dwell in there for hundreds of years, right? Their descendants are growing generations in Egypt, Africa for hundreds of years, right? Being also sent down the Nile, right? Being persecuted by the Egyptians for a while until they're to this, where some leave out and they dwell in the wilderness for a while and they dwell in areas of the Levant. So the time that you're thinking about when they go into Europe, you're thinking like after like after Iron Age. Like we're talking, this is why we more relate them to more groups of Africa, because they're going into Egypt and they're going to areas of Arabia, which is going to go connect Yemen and Abyssinia and stuff like that, where more Shemites were also in those areas, but not areas of like Finland and Europe and Turkestan and stuff like that. That would be more of some of the later invaders of like sea people and stuff like that. That's why it's important to be careful when comparing who are the bloodline Israelites. They're going to be more of groups who we find as Yap lineages, of those Y lineages, of E lineages. We can find those in people like the Arameans, right? Semitic groups that settled over there, or ancient Semitic groups, Proto-Semitic groups like Natufians that has settled in the Levant, or groups like different that settled around Egypt, because we know that certain men like Joseph, they got with Egyptians. He had two sons. They were the lineages that grew up in the transition at the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, called Ephraim, Manasseh, also sons of Benjamin, who were Jews. They also became parts with those women who were Egyptians. So a large portion of Egypt became part with the Israelites. So they would have darker tone because of many mixtures. For example, even Moses, who was of like the tribe of Levi, which was a close tribe of the Jews. And that is something that's important to know, that he got with a Cushite, which was of the darker tribes. And that's something that we know, that many of the Israelites, as we know, makes sense that they had the African mixture, even recent African mixture, even that mixture exactly at their development, is that they would be a group that, looking at historically and genetically, they would be more of a middle southern area of the Levant and higher African culture. And that group that we see also sometimes going into areas of Africa have genetic ties to those groups. So what I'm saying is, yes, a large portion does have connections to Israelites, but I'm telling you that who they are, they have an ancient African origin. So that's what's important, is that I'm not saying every African is Israelites, but I'm telling you that there was a African haplogroup that came into Africa and replace some of the groups in Africa. So that's what's important to know about, is that E group that replaces those ancient A and B groups. That E group is that group that pops up, and I'm talking E1, B1A exactly, that pops up later after the Neolithic. So it rises in Neolithic Eurasia, pops up, going down into Africa, and then starts to take over the Bronze Age, Iron Age cultures. And that's what's important to note, is that connection, how it moves, and it goes about like that.
Well, so my first question would be, is there's a bunch of different groups of Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardi Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, the Indian Jews, and they all have different Y-DNA aspects, that they come from different lineages that all spread in different directions from Israel. And you're saying
right,
that,
and that's why it's important to look at each individual Y chromosome directly from its ancient ancestral node.
well,
So
how do you tell which one is the correct one?
we look at the node, we look at the ancient ancestral node. For example, the ancient ancestral node. For example, let's say like my haplogroup. My haplogroup is R1b, right? Many people know it as an Indo-European line, right? Many people know it as an Indo-European line or things like that. But it also has ancient presence in Africa. And that's something that's important to know, is like how ancient these lineages diverge and split and go into different areas. So it's looking at those ancient nodes, and it takes time. Yes, that's why a lot of our lives are hours looking up genetic papers and the fossils in their movements to find that Bronze Age culture, which one was that node.
Well, so my question is more, I have a more general question here. Like, so we know that there is a large lineage of Jews from the time period of the Bronze Age when Abraham was supposed to live, and the true Jews could be any of these. How do you tell which group of which descendants? And I would guess all of them would be. I don't know why we'd limit it to one of them, but
we can limit them. I'll explain why we can limit it to one. It's about that Neolithic bottleneck. Now, if you know, in the Neolithic time, right, this is when Noah pops up. Noah pops up in a Neolithic culture, and what happens is there's a Neolithic bottleneck, which we know genetically there's a Neolithic bottleneck. This is important because many mammals in that time in the Neolithic go through a bottleneck and a massive extinction event, right? We can talk about events from the middle of the transition of the said events from the oldest and younger Dryas. We can also talk about the events of the Capic wipeout event that had happened to many different animals and humans at that time, that left all humans coming from, like I said, specific node of BT and CT, which when we start looking at the split at that Neolithic time, what we notice is this. We notice that IJK, haplogroups of IJK, are highly related. Haplogroups of GHIJK, HIJK, and IJK is related. The reason why that's important is because they point to the same descendants of Japheth. So if we can connect, there's many different haplogroups, but if we can start connect them monophyletically.
So I agree with the Neolithic bottleneck. That's the thing. I totally agree. 99.9% of all humans are the same because of this, because there's very few lineages came from this, but that applies to like all humans. So this doesn't really narrow it down much. This eliminates like the Eskimos. That's about it. But so I don't see how. So we go from the Neolithic. There's a very small bottleneck where most humans come from. I agree. And this gets us to how we exclude certain Jews. How? Because all of the Jews have the same Neolithic bottleneck markers. I don't see like.
Well, that's when it gets really interesting. So remember that study I was talking about. So the study that looked at the ancient Mizrahi and Iraqi Jews, we know that a lot of the groups that basically became Jews now, we have to process that there were many proselytes that were converted, Greeks and Persians that had converted to Judaism right before even the coming up of the Persians that converted some of the groups in Khazaria. Now, I'm not saying every the modern Jews are Khazars, but there are many Jews that are Khazars today that have merged with many groups. And what's important about that is that the groups that became Khazars was split originally from a group called Gog Turks. Now, what's important about that is that the groups of Turks, some of them by religious standards, became many different branches of the Abrahamic religions. Now, if we remember, the Abrahamic religions started around Arabia, but the Gog Turks came from Turkestan, Mongolia. So we're talking the Seljuk Turks, that from the Seljuk Turks rose the Ottoman Turks, and the Ottoman Turks became Islamic. And that's important because many people think people of Islam are the Arabs, and they think that originally they would trace to Ishmael. So if someone was to be religiously Muslim, they would think they would also be in a sense of Ishmael. Now, also interesting is that the same branch of the Gog Turks settled in parts of Khazaria. And that what's important about that is that's why that group is called Khazars, named off of the land and the river in Khazaria. And that group converted in 700 ADs to Judaism. And that group, and we know because by 900 AD, there was a man named, forgive me if I say his name wrong, I think it's John ben Aaron, John son of Aaron, or Jason son of Aaron, something like that. Or no, Joseph son of Aaron, Joseph ben Aaron, with Joseph ben Aaron the Khazar, so I can make that right, is that he actually had tried to basically bring out a paper to show if he was actually a Jew, but they end up finding out that they were actually from the line of Japheth. The interesting thing about that is because as they go through the process of those groups of the north, they talk about that this saying that's also spoken of in the Bible, that's also spoken of in history, these nations called Gog and Magog. And the reason why that's important, they say Gog and Magog, or Magog especially, would be of Japheth. And that's actually what they say, that many of the groups from Mongolia, or Gog Turks, they actually would have been branches originally from Turkestan, which also, that's why looking at ancient haplogroups in the Bronze Age, many of those haplogroups that we can exclude from being Jews, if we find them in the Bronze Age, in areas of like Asia, far out like that, especially during the movements of the Israelites, we start to realize that there's a major difference in who are the Israelites that developed in areas of Africa, Egypt, and also being sent down the Nile, versus groups that be developed in European or Indo-European or Indo-Iranian nations that came later in, that developed with those groups as proselytes and converts. That again, in religious terms, they would be accepted as religious, but as an ancient original group that came from the Neolithic bottleneck of the Shemites until the growth of those late Hebrews. Because remember, Abraham was a Hebrew, and those Hebrews will come from a Semitic stock of Afro-Asiatic branches or Afro-Asiatic groups, which that's why I say after the Neolithic rise, that Bronze Age, E1B1A.
When you said that the Ashkenazi Jews are Khazars, that seems clearly
no.
false.
I didn't say the Ashkenazi Jews are Khazars. I said many Jews are Khazars. That's what I'm saying. Many Jews today are Khazars. Not all Jews, okay, but many are. But Ashkenazis are the largest group of the Jews that developed the haplogroup of the Khazars. Like I2 is confirmed as a haplogroup of the Khazars.
So the data I'm looking at right here says
Q,
of the chromosomes in Ashkenazi Jews do indeed represent the vestige of the mysterious Khazars. Then, according to our data, this contribution was limited to either a single founder or a few closely related men and does not exceed 12% of present-day Ashkenazi-isms. So it's 12% max.
12% times that by the millions of them. So that's important to know. That's why I'm saying they have the largest growth of those Khazars. Yes, they have portion of them, but not all of them are Khazars, because actually a portion of them, actually 35% of them, connects to ancient Shemites, like the E1B1B groups. That connects to ancient Shemites.
But I'm not seeing how this eliminates Ashkenazi Jews from being the true descendants of Abraham or whatever. So, because they could be.
No, I'm telling you that the portion that we just confirmed as Khazars can't be.
Right, but that's only like 12% of Ashkenazi, so that doesn't eliminate Ashkenazi Jews.
Of course, I never said that none of the Ashkenazis are them. In fact, I just said that, in fact, we did a genetic study that there are groups of Ashkenazis that are Jews. We found an Ashkenazi with E1B1A, and he is confirmed to be an Ashkenazi Jew. And that's important to understand that portions of the Jews, that's why we said that they had an African admixture, and that portions of the modern Jews have a Indo-European mixture. That's why, just like you said, yeah, 12%, like you said, have Khazar admixture. But guess what? The Jews that we know went to groups like San Tome, right? Because there were Jews that were sent to areas of Africa, islands like San Tome y Principe, and those Jews don't have a Khazarian mixture. They don't have that Indo-European mixture. They're the
they went the other direction.
They're the ancient Jews that were sent down into Africa.
Yes. So before they started to mix with that gene group, they split up and went different directions. So yes, there's different groups of Jews. I agree. So
yes, and that's the point, is that the ancient Jews didn't get that Khazarian mixture that came in the Middle Age, but the ancient Jews would be the ones that did that in the European mixture, the ones who went deeper into Africa and areas of Arabia before the later invasions of Levant, like the Turkification of the Levant.
So the ancient Jews existed, and the ancient Jews could have gone to Khazar and gotten some of that. Like they could have continued to multiply.
But when would that happen? What time frame would that happen? Because I just told you, there's a paper we confirmed that the African admixture goes 32,000 years ago, or even 3,200 years ago, even 2,600 years ago. So where would they pick up a Khazarian admixture? No, only in the Middle Age, because every study tells us that that mixture of that Khazarian mixture is in the Middle Age. So that Indo-European admixture is a later mixture, not an ancient mixture. So that means the ancient mixture is the African admixture, as we can find, just like we see in the studies we find.
Can you give me an argument, premise, conclusion that tries to like filter out all the things you're saying into like a brief argument of what you're trying to say? Because right now it just seems like a bunch of random facts about genetic data, which like most of which is correct and doesn't make a difference to the argument. Like what is the argument?
The argument is that the conclusion is that a lot of people, when they look at Jews today, is that they think the original Jews would have looked like the Middle Age mixture that came in with some of the converts that converted. But rather, what I'm saying is that the ancient Jews still look the same today, that they look almost like ancient people. They look African, and that even when they're sent into captivity to different areas, they still hold that African admixture. And a lot of them had, as we have seen later in the Middle Age, got an Indo-European mixture.
What is an ancient Jew? How old is ancient Jew?
An ancient Jew is a Jew whose line would connect all the way to the Bronze Age culture of Egypt, of the Israelites that developed in the areas of Egypt.
So wouldn't they look like Egyptians?
Yes, and the Egyptians looked at dark skin. They looked at very dark skin. And Egyptians also were mating with the Nubians. We know because certain kings during the time, like King Tut and his lineages, they were mixing with the Nubians. We know that they were having relations with the Nubians. For example, I was just doing a talk about the Hyksos and how during a later time, the Nubians became very close to the Egyptians, and we know that the Egyptians
there were
also
different
gave
skin
the
colors
to Joseph.
Egyptians had a spectrum of skin colors. They weren't black; they were white, black, and everything in between.
Yeah, they had a. We know they had a mixture, and that's the point. That's the most important thing, is that the Egyptians mixed in later with Israel, but that's going to be a later mix. The original mix that we need to look at is the one that came from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that would have developed from the Hebrews, because remember, Hebrew is from a Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic column. So that's going to be important to note, is that we need to find out, where does Afro-Asiatic come from? Because Hebrew, again, Abraham is one group, one person from a lineage of those Afro-Asiatic groups.
Wait, so where do you think Abraham was born?
Well, he was born in Ur.
Yeah, like where would that be today?
So there's obviously a scholarly consensus on that. Some say Syria, some say areas near Babylon. Right, I believe it's at the Euphrates. I'll just say it's at Euphrates.
And the people who live there are more Middle Eastern, not black, right?
Well, if you look at culture, for example, it depends if you look at ancient culture or modern culture. If you look at ancient culture of those areas, a lot of those groups were darker skinned. For example, in the areas of Sumeria, you had groups that were called black-headed people and things like that. And we also know that Natufians had went over there, which were also E1B1B groups. So that's important to understand that the Neolithic culture, Neolithic culture, had a large portion of those E-M96 lineages spreading throughout those areas. So we're talking early E lineages
I'm not
spreading throughout those
following your
areas.
argument there. So, like,
The
the skin
point is
color divide in humanity.
lineage developed in the Neolithic in that area, is what I'm saying.
Well, no, so I don't agree with your argument that people in that area were black. Like, no, they were the same color as Middle Easterns are today.
Well,
Like,
what is your when you're saying black, what are you saying when you say black? Because when you say black, I'm referencing the haplogroup that most people call black, which is the E haplogroup. A lot of people say E is African is black. So when you're saying black, are you saying a skin pigmentation, or are you saying the E haplogroup?
No, I'm using skin pigmentation here. So I think that Abraham,
that's not a science. We know that skin as a genetic definition is not a science, right? That wouldn't make any sense to say that is a genetic black people, right?
No, I'm going off of what you said earlier. Like, what did Abraham look like? Did he look like what are modern day Middle Easterns or more modern day Africans? He looks more like modern day Middle Easterns.
Well, we got to remember the way that the Middle East looked like at that time. It was like a desert, and it was like a warm, tropical forest in some places. But where Abraham was by the Euphrates, we got to also know that he could have had a middle tone. He most likely was not fully like a super dark Ethiopian, or he most likely was not super light like someone from Iceland, but he was most likely a mid-tone. So I would say, based upon the scriptures and based upon what we're seeing on some of the studies, that he was a Hebrew, which the Hebrew branch comes from Afro-Asiatic, and a lot of the Afro-Asiatics, whether they were R1B, whether they was E1B1B, a lot of them that were centered around areas of the Levant had a SLC 45A2 mutation in them, which SLC 45A2 actually contributes to darker skin pigmentation. So being in that area close to the equator in the Middle East, going down into areas of the Levant, which remember the Levant is actually on the edge or the corner of the African plate. So he would have had a darker pigmentation for the fact that he was on the African plate. That would have been something that would have made sense. So he would have had like a mid-tone. I would say something like maybe close to like some light-skinned brown person, some like maybe like a little lighter than, like, I'll say, like brown, like I'll say like a brown tone, like a milky brown tone, I would say, for that, especially for that environment. Now he could be all types of tones. He could be darker than that. But the interesting thing is, if we follow his family tree, his family line from the language column that he comes from those Hebrews, we find out that those E1B1B groups were Hebrews and Aramaeans in those areas. And we know that the Natufians, their skin tone looked kind of dark skin. And even their descendants to this day have high portions of dark skinned individuals. But some of those lineages of those E groups also have light skin. We can find people that also develop those light skin. And that's why I also was showing E1B1A, a Jew that was found in Ashkenaz that had a lighter skin tone. He looked kind of like Hispanic, like a darker tone.
Right.
Hispanic.
So it could have been any of these. We don't really know. I don't think Abraham existed at all, but he could have been any of these, and his lineage could have gone any of these directions. And so why do you think
that's the point of pigmentation is not a representation of a people group. So pigmentation, as we know, the science. It's not a science as
the point here is to make us
a race.
Do we have Well, the point is here is, do we have any reason to think that Abraham's lineage, if it existed, went down into Africa as opposed to up into
Yes.
like Germany? Why?
Yes, because the scriptures, is what the scriptures is like a biography. And if someone wants to challenge that, we can clarify it by showing how the scriptures verifies almost every king of Egypt, every king of Assyria, every king of Babylon that it deals with. And when Abraham comes in, it also has what we call synchronisms. And and we know that he pops up during the time of one of the kings of Babylon called Hammurabi. And what's interesting about that is we know Hammurabi's law is there, Hammurabi's code, but we know that Abraham is going down, he's leaving those areas and he's going down into areas of Canaan. And he's going into areas of deeper areas of like the 13th dynasty of Egypt. And he's these lower cultures. What happens is he starts to make allegiance with the Amorites. What we start to do is use what's called the process of elimination. So we study who are the Kassites, who are many of the northern nations of that season and that time in the Bronze Age. Once we eliminate those, we start to realize that one haplogroup is not showing up as the culture that's being diverse in those times in the north. E1B1A. So E1B1A, what's interesting about it, if you look at the fossils, exactly E1B1A, especially E1B1A7, pops up in the Bronze Age, right, is leaving areas of Egypt and is spreading throughout different areas of Africa. It is also found today in other places in areas of Arabia and areas, especially in areas where is, and areas of Syria and of many places of the Levant. What's
So
interesting about
it
that?
seems like your argument is that this gene marker is of a group that Abraham visited and lived in for a time. Therefore, this group is the lineage of Abraham.
No, what I'm saying is that this lineage, the exact subgroup of this lineage, popped up in the Bronze Age, just like when Abraham had proceeded in the areas of Arabia, went to Egypt. It popped up in the Bronze Age in Africa, and it starts to develop and increase in the Iron Age. So that in the Iron Age, we now have a large group of this E1B1A culture that all of a sudden popped up largely in the Iron Age. We don't see it a lot in the Neolithic Age by fossils. What we find is that some of his fossils are found in Eurasia. And what's interesting about that is that Abraham, again, he's not the first of his line. He has a father named Terah and other fathers before him that lead to Shem. That's a large family that makes groups of different nodes or clades, like Jotanites, which is a totally different clade, but from the same Shemites, from the Eberites. And what's interesting about that, again, going from Eber to Peleg all the way down to Abraham, is that Abraham's descendants, the ones that are called Israelites, directly, the clade of Israelites, they develop in the areas of Egypt, Africa, and they're sent down the Nile, and they develop in the areas of Levant, and they don't pass Byblos. So in the areas of Levant, where you see going up, they don't pass Byblos until after the rise of Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians. And that's important. Until the Assyrian conquest, right? Tiglath-Pileser and the changes of Neo-Babylon, right? In the Iron Age, that's when we start to see those groups go north. And we also can find evidence of E1B1A coming north a little later, because E1B1A developed in the south in Egypt first. So it's a certain clade. This is a clade that comes from the E lineage. So the E lineage is Shemites. And we can find out if it's Shemites, and we can find out the evidence that they were Shemites, because they have different connections to Shemitic cultures. And so they start moving because of certain invasions.
This lineage originated around the same time Abraham went to Africa.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean it's Abraham's lineage, like, because there are thousands of lineages that originate from that time period in that location.
Well, you know what's interesting? You know what's interesting about that? There was a study on the Israelites at Lachish, at the area of Lachish, that was besieged by the Assyrians. And you know what they actually found out? That the skulls of the women had Negroid features. So there's a lot of studies on those groups, and they actually compare them to Egyptians. And they say that the skulls of those in the areas of those Israelites, genetically tie to those Egyptians. And what's interesting about those Egyptians that they were connecting to is that they were saying those Egyptians connected with Nubians. And what's interesting about that is that during the rise of the Israelites, when they had left in the Exodus, many of them kept fleeing to Egypt and they kept going into the Semitic nation of Nubia. And Nubia was very Semitic during the Iron Age and later. And that was something that was important because in between Nubia and or basically on the sides of Nubia was Egypt and Punt, which Punt or Abyssinia was a very strong nation, which also had connections to movements of Jottanites going down from Yemen into those areas, which were Shemites. And in the middle was Nubia. So in the middle of Egypt and Abyssinia was Nubia. And many of the Israelites, even in the biblical narrative, was recorded fleeing deeper into past Egypt into a nation deeper into Africa. And that's what's important to know is that we're connecting this group again that increased after the Neolithic bottleneck and would show ties in Egypt, Africa, and also would show that they would be, as we can connect with other genetic sources, connection to Israelites, and the fact that
how does that show that any of this is
it.
connected to Abraham's lineage?
Because they literally found Israelites that were besieged by Assyrians in the Iron Age that were connected to the African groups that I just told you about. They literally found Israelites.
How does that show it's related to Abraham? So I mean, obviously there were
Israelites because
period.
they're literally Israelites. Like it's kind of like if I was to say we're looking for the Spartans, right? Who are the Spartans and everything? And I literally dig up an ancient Spartan from the exact time frame that they lived. That's what I'm saying. They found actual Israelites. Right?
Well, how does that how would that show that Spartan was Leonidas? It wouldn't, right? You'd be like, it could be any of the Spartans, right? So the fact that there are Israelites doesn't mean this is a direct descendant of Abraham.
You're right. You're right. The best way to prove it would be with the scriptures. And the great thing about that is that we not only got a verification from Sennacherib's prism that those were Israelites, but we also got word for word in the book of Kings that says that the ones that were besieged in those cities were Jews. And the reason why that's important, because that city didn't just have the northern tribe there, it had Jews there. So that's what made it important, is that city was besieged before the kings of Assyria reached Jerusalem. They besieged the areas of Lachish. And that's what we've seen, is that they found bunches of heads, a bunch of Judean heads that were all set up by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians had set those there, and those were the Jews right before he reached Jerusalem.
There were more Jews than just Abraham, right? He had fathers and grandfathers.
Right, but that's great, because that's talking from Abraham, which would be the ancestral node. He would bring forth the clade of Israelites. That means it's great that we have many of them now, because that's how clades work. Abraham would be from him would proceed the ancestral clades, which would proceed even to our time. So the clade is the group of the Jews. And that's what we found there, connecting them with a PCA, which is a principal component study.
So I'm saying at Abraham's time, there was already many Jews that already existed, right?
At Abraham's time, there were no Jews that existed at Abraham's time. You verify that with a source, because there were no Jews at Abraham's time.
As in his genes, the genes that got to him already existed in other lineages, right? So whatever the group you want to call, Abraham was a part of some.
Right, but you can't sit here and tell me that there were Jews in Abraham's time. Right, because one of the biggest things,
whatever group he's a part of, whatever group Abraham is a part of, whatever haplogroup, whatever.
Haplogroup. There we go. So haplogroup, you're talking about Abraham, who would be a subgroup of the ancient group of DE. So his ultimate node, again, would be the Shem. And then that diverged into Shemites. So we're talking Jottanites, Eberites, people of the ancient proto Ammonites. Before that, they fall, or
Right,
You
right. So
also
there's a
get
bunch
the
a
areas
bunch
of
of
Ammon.
lineages. There's a bunch of
Right.
lineages that come from that time period. And my
So
question
the
is how do you
subclade,
identify which one of these bunches of lineages that come at that exact time period and that exact location is the Abraham one as opposed to the other ones that are just not Abraham ones?
exactly. So that's why it's a process of elimination. Once you establish who are the genetic Kassites, right? I'm sure you know, if you look at who are the genetic Kassites, who are the genetic Amorites, right? These are nations that would have been there before Abraham. Who are the genetic, all the groups, like we were talking proto Neolithic Bronze Age cultures, those are the ones we want to look at and verify what are there so we can verify those are not the lineages of Abraham. And that's why I'm telling you that
How
E1B1A
how do you do that?
exactly,
How do you do
right?
that? How do you say those are not the lineages of Abraham? What is it that
Because
proves they're not?
they exist before Abraham has Israelites children, right? Like Abraham has many children. He has children of Keturah, he has children with you know, the Hagar, but he has the Israelites that pop up in the Bronze Age, and those ones
So
develop
you're
in
saying that
Africa.
those particular ones have the wrong female chromosome, so they couldn't be from Abraham, something like that?
No, no, no.
No.
That's talking mtDNA, which is from mother to mother to daughter. That's a totally different topic. But again, what I'm saying is Abraham would be a lineage that would come from an ancestral node. So his clade proceed after him, right? Because remember, Abraham, he has also a nephew named Lot, and he has Ammon and Moab. So they would be genetically related to them. So they also should be E groups. And that's what we find is that we can find these E groups still in the Levant in these cultures. And one of the interesting culture ties is again looking at their ancient ties, like Natufians, right? Ancient Levantan culture that settled in the areas of the Levant that grew. So we can find, yes, Abraham's ancient family that migrated, yes, to areas of Syria. And then by the time of Abraham, when he existed in the Bronze Age, went back down the Levant and went down into areas of Egypt, Africa. So we got to remember that it's a culture that, again, like you said, went up to Euphrates and then went back down into Africa. And then at the Bronze Age, that node would have popped up in the Bronze Age, and E1B1A pops up in the Bronze Age, ruling in the Iron Age in areas around Egypt and Levant and Africa. And that's the lineage that we have to look at because its line of E1B1 star groups show that they have Semitic ties to Semitic cultures, like the 14 BC culture of the Arameans, who are Semitic culture in Alaka. And is something that we can look at. We can find the Semitic Hebrew groups or Semitic groups of the Afro-Asiatic groups and find out that whatever node it is that pops up, especially around like Avaris or around the time of the Israelites, that does it also connect to modern culture like the Canaanites and other groups like that. Those like the Amorites, the Kassites, and all that. We know that that group will be that group that popped up as the Israelites, which is E1B1A, especially E1B1A 7, E1B1A 8, which would be the northern tribes and the southern tribes. And those are the groups that in the Iron Age start to increase and develop in those areas, especially during Solomon's time when he started working with the Phoenicians and conquering many different areas.
All right. I think it would help if you would formulate your argument clear without all the different technical language to try to make it easier for people to understand, because a lot of people are saying they don't understand what your argument is. But we have been going for about an hour, and we do have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Zelensky asks, why is this relevant? Anyone can convert and become a Jew or Hebrew Israelite regardless of ethnicity, genetics, or skin pigmentation. And two, is it okay if they mix with other ethnicities?
So why is it relevant? Because it's a people's history. It's like someone saying they're ancient Celtic. Right? They find out they're Celtic and they want to hold their heritage. What I'm saying is that a lot of these people lost their heritage, and it would be very healing for these people to have their heritage back. It's not hurting anyone for these people to have their heritage back. And a lot of times there's a racist prejudice on these people when they get into the land of Israel, that they're being kicked out of that land because it's saying, well, they're not Jews. And a lot of times the standard isn't based off of genetic tests, and that genetic tests show that they're genetic Jews who are actually ancient genetic Jews who are now Africans, or developed as a large part of those Iron Age African groups, even groups that they call Bantu, that we can show that those groups had connections to Israel 2,000 years ago, and things like that. But that saying, is it okay to mix with other groups? Well, the important thing is that the reason why Israel was selected, because they was going to be a dedicated group that would follow a certain set of laws and commandments. Now, when the temple fell the first time, God forgave them and brought Ezra and told them not to mix with the nations, to the Jews only. So not the northern tribes, but to the Jews. And that also brought division between the northern tribes, like Samaria. Sometimes you hear that saying of Jesus, the Good Samaritan. That's because of that separation of the Samaritans and the Jews. But there's a promise that because then the temple fell because Messiah said they would go into captivity again to all nations. Then the temple fell, and it was no longer a law that was holding them. When I'm saying a law, I'm saying the Old Testament that was holding them, but Christ that is holding them. And so that does change, like it says, as there has been a change to the priesthood, because Messiah is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, there's also been a change to the law. So that's an important thing to understand, that there's no law that's forcing Israelites or condemning Israelites if they did mix, because a lot of Israelites now did mix. So that's what I'm saying, is that, yeah, many people have that admixture, but it's not a condemnation anymore from the mix. But if they want to hold their heritage and stay true to their heritage, and they're not like trying to fight, and one of the biggest things I also want to address is that I don't believe the hate doctrine. I don't believe there's a lot of things that I talk about on my page. And one of the biggest things I talk about is that we can find out the heritage of these people without causing divisions within other people's heritages. So I guess that's, if it's their choice of the mixing and all that.
Gotcha. Raphael Amawan asks, who is salvation for?
Salvation is, as the scripture says, when Messiah popped up, he says salvation is from the Jews, but salvation is for the world. How do we know? Because the scripture says, look to me, and the Old Testament says, look to me and be you saved, all the ends of the earth. So all the ends of the earth are actually welcome to come to his salvation, because even in Isaiah, he says in another place that his altar shall be altar for everyone, right? So the prayers of other nations will be accepted. But what he wants is righteousness first, because even he punished Israelites, right? He judged even his own people. So God is not a God of, he doesn't put any favors, or he doesn't put someone over someone because they're born a certain way. But salvation is for anyone who finds righteousness to be born again.
Gotcha. Next question is from Max Rose. Please ask him what religion Ashkenazi Jews should follow.
Christ. Every group in the world should follow Christ. Every single group. And that's one of the biggest things, that Yeshua HaMashiach is the only way to salvation, period, is that they should follow Christ. Because when it comes down to bloodline, them claiming to be Jews, a lot of them are not Jews.
So Christ, like Jesus Christ, is that correct?
Yes, Jesus Christ.
All right. Outback asks, apologies if you have asked this already, but ask LIONFARM about polytheism in ancient Israel culture found in archaeology. What is his response to this?
So we know that as early as the transition of the Bronze Age and Iron Age, there is found in the Israelite culture that they did get into some of the Baal worship, and which is monotheism and all that, and I mean polytheism and all that. But when the Israelites decided to go into monotheism, or just one God, instead of the polytheism with the multiple gods, that's when they was leaving the Exodus. But even God witnessed in the Exodus, the writings of the Exodus, that they were doing polytheism even in the desert. They were not only worshiping God, they started worshiping Baal. They started making craft images and stuff. And not only that, in the writing, as soon as they got to the lands of Israel, they start worshiping Baal, and they were taken by some of the nations of their first captivity in the book of Judges is by some of the nations of Euphrates. The groups of Euphrates basically took them because they were worshiping Baal worshipers in Canaan. So that was one of the biggest things with Israel, is that they constantly was messing up, but that's why they needed the Messiah.
Gotcha. Nico Blasts, ask him, when was the Bronze Age and the Iron Age? What are the hard dates?
So when is the Bronze Age and Iron Age? That's such a question, because it all depends what are we talking about. Are we talking about Bronze Age, Iron Age in Europe, or Bronze Age, Iron Age in Africa? They say, this is controversial, but they say Bronze Age, Iron Age in Africa was sooner than in Europe. So they say the Bronze Age or the Iron Age in Africa was sooner, but that's because they look at that Bantu culture. That's why you got to be careful looking at that Bantu culture, because that Bantu culture actually is that group that left from Egypt, because that's where iron actually came from Egypt, going in deeper into areas of Africa. So it all depends on when they first started to pick up iron, which again, it depends on what time, what region we're talking about.
Gotcha. 60-second skeptic asks, if you discovered you were not the genetic background you think you are, would you change your religious beliefs in any way?
Well, if I discovered that I'm not R1B and maybe find out E1B1A, that would be great, because then I'd be amazed, because that would be ancient Israelites. But my line is what I believe to be an unbiased line for me. And that's a line that actually works out for my case, because I'm just trying to establish the fact that there are ancient Israelites, and that if it so happens that somehow I mixed in by whatever process it was, then amen. But if somehow I'm not that, amen too, because I believe by faith. So there's nothing that could change faith that would be a physical force, because faith is established by the writings itself.
Gotcha. Blow Me Up 2 Day asked, who was the first Jew?
The first ever Jew. Now, because we got to understand what a Jew is. A Jew is the process of the groups that came together and lived in Jerusalem and would call themselves residents of Judah. So a Jew, even though the breakdown, the Strong's word of Jew, it wouldn't actually be said like Jew. It has a little different way of saying it. But pretty much, long story short, the definition of Jew would be a resident of Jerusalem. That's why Benjamin's tribes of Benjamin, Levi, and Judah were all groups of Jews. So technically a Jew would be all those that had joined with Judah, which would be with David. So that would be in a sense of when the Jews, or the sense of a Jew, starts to, in the phrase, pop up, versus just being an Israelite. So
Gotcha. Ball Diablo asked, is he saying that Jew bones were of African structure / build, or what?
you said, were the Jew bones of African structure and build?
Yeah, you were talking about how the skulls and things had African, looked African or something. There was something about that.
Yeah. On LIONFARM, if you type LIONFARM DNA, we talk a lot about the finds. Maybe I'll talk about it a little later today. I talked about the sources directly out, and this, I kid you not, word for word says that the Jews that were examined after the siege of Assyria say that they had, by looking at their bone structure, had African nose, African structure. They could tell just by the nose, and they also could tell from the designs by the Assyrians when they besieged Lachish, and they put the depictions of the Jews with their depictions. Is something worth checking out. And also, one of the most important things about the structure of the African admixture, the African structure of the Jews, is that we can find the connections in history. So that the connections with history and the places where they're found. So if you want to see like the word for word reading of it, I'll read some of that maybe sometime this week.
Blow Me Up asks, who was Judah from?
Judah was from, as we know, there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob received the blessing name of Israel. So Judah came from the one who is the last one, Jacob, Israel. So Judah will be right from him.
Gotcha. Blomy also asks, so Jacob wasn't a Jew.
Jacob himself would not technically be a Jew, because a Jew technically, because someone would say, yeah, a Jew would come from Jacob, but Jacob himself wouldn't be called a Jew, because a Jew would be a resident of Jerusalem, and they haven't yet entered into Jerusalem to separate themselves from the other tribes. Because also the important thing about a Jew is that a Jew would be considered not the other 10 tribes of Israel. So the Jews would technically be Benjamin, Judah, and Levi that separated themselves from the northern tribes of Israel. So the term, especially when we look in the scripture, the term Jew only pops up in the Iron Age.
Gotcha. Rafahan Amawan asks, who are the Israelites today?
The Israelites today is what they are. They're going to be exactly the Y chromosome of E1B1A. They're going to also be from the female lines of L, and mainly L2 and L3, that had came together after the Neolithic time frame and had developed into a Bronze Age and Iron Age culture. Those are going to be the original ancient Israelites. There's also going to be groups that mix in with them. For reference, look at the genetic results of Santo Tomé y Principe Jewish groups that have settled there.
He also asked, does God hate?
God, he hates evil. So he hates those that hate their brothers. So that's why you will see like places that say, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. That reference was because Esau hated Jacob. And if he killed Jacob, he also would have basically destroyed the way for the Messiah to also be brought forth. And also the blessing that was on Jacob. And that was one of the biggest things, that Esau became like a stranger because he lost his birthright. And that's what was the saying, is that the Lord hates strangers that hate those who are his children or hate him. So the Lord does not put forth anything towards the dead. Like, for example, the scripture, Messiah says God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead. So who he hates is the dead. So that's why Messiah says those who are baptized are saved, and those who are not, they're basically dead, and they're already in condemnation. So that will be the explanation for that, is that if one was to be dead and continue in death, it doesn't mean that he doesn't offer a way for them to be saved, but it means that they have chosen a way of death, and he hates death.
Gotcha. Molasses asked, why is there no archaeological, cultural, or other evidence of Jews in the regions he claims?
Which reason? Regions, sir?
It's a good question. So Molasses, if you're still in the chat, please let us know. Ball asks, if they're so upset about losing their cultural heritage, why aren't they learning the language? I imagine he means Hebrew.
Well, yeah, they're obviously learning Hebrew. Like, for example, the Black Jews in Dahomey are learning Hebrew. So by saying they're not learning their language, Hebrew is actually, modern Hebrew is not ancient Hebrew. So it's also the sense of that it's lost. Like, the language is almost in a way lost. So they would actually have to bow down in a way and learn modern Hebrew, and then build their way up to learn ancient Hebrew. Unless someone self-teaches themselves ancient Hebrew, or gets a private tutor for studying ancient Hebrew, which is not, if you notice, not a lot of people who are actually of African descent have such privileges and stuff like that. It's something that's important to know. And I'm not saying that none of them are rich or none of them have money, but it's not something that people say, well, my life is going so well, I might as well just learn some Hebrew and learn my heritage, right? A lot of people have lost their heritage and don't even know who they are. But the ones who find out who they are, or that return to places like Israel, like Dahomey, the Israelites in Dahomey, they are picking up their ancient heritage and returning to their roots, just like many Jews in Africa. So there's a lot.
Molasses responded, the Nubian African regions that you were talking about is where you said that there's no...
in Nubia?
Yeah.
So again, in Nubia, right, we got to understand that those ones pop up at the Iron Age. So there's no E1B1A there before the Iron Age. So that's one of the biggest things, that fossils. So yeah, they do pop up after the Iron Age. And that was the point, is that As Israelites fled into Egypt, they went into Nubia, and that would be via Iron Age.
Fossils? Fossils take 10,000 years to form. Fossils? What do you mean by fossils there?
Say it one more time.
You said we can use fossils. Fossils take 10,000 years to form, so I don't think it was fossils. What do you mean by fossils?
Well, there's we can have fossils that were only formed within the last 100 years or 1,000 years. But we do have like ancient fossils. So when we're talking like fossil record, like for example, if we're saying fossils, we're talking about a culture that was buried within its time frame in the layer of its time frame. Like,
or you just mean archaeological evidence. Like a fossil is specifically like a biological structure that became stone over time. It takes a minimum of 10,000 years, but you just mean archaeological data, archaeological finds.
Yeah. I guess I guess we'll just say that. That's better. Let's make it scientific.
Gotcha.
Archaeological data.
Bloviator Bomber asks, why should we believe the Bible is true?
Why shouldn't wait? Why shouldn't we believe, or why should we believe?
Why should we believe?
Oh, why should we? So the reason why we should believe the Bible is true is because it's not putting itself out as an sense to. It's not first. Its premise is Earth-based. It's not saying they're from planet Nublion from thousands of years or this and that. It's talking like it's coming in a sense of something logical. It's popping up in the Bronze Age. It's telling you about real cultures, real places, real people that's going through these very hard things, that's having real children, these children are developing into this very special cultures. Even the fact that the Bible told us about the Hittites before the world knew about the Hittites. Before the 1800s, 1700s, they never knew about the Hittites. But the Bible told us about the Hittite culture. And then they discovered, and they were saying, oh, the Bible's a lie. There's no Hittites. All of a sudden, they discovered the Hittites. And they find out that, yeah, the Bible is telling the truth. It's a book that's written in a very timely manner. Even the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament is very real. And you can look at it almost with a scalpel and go about it with surgical precision and find out that it's all exactly at its time. So it's not a book that's trying to lie or hide anything. It's a book that's telling you real things and real events and just giving it to you straight forward and saying, this is the way to be saved. As we know, we all are dirt, all going to die. But the only way to be saved is this way. So, and even the fact that good things came from it, like hospitals, the original way of the hospital. I'm not talking about the dream hospitals of the Greeks. Talk about the real hospital that we see today. That's something that came from Christ, from the Christians. So it has a great foundation and it has great motives and it has great causes that it does. That's why I say it's worth believing, because it's the best thing for mankind.
All right. Blow Me Up asks, so you believe in genetics? Do you believe in evolution?
No, because the most interesting thing when you look at genetics, you'll notice something interesting that happens is that all genetic constantly go through what is called mutations, or they constantly degrade. But we don't see all of a sudden something gets more information and becomes something evolved or something new. I don't believe genetic families. I believe that there are certain kinds of families that constantly make their same kind. And we get these different kinds that we see later on, the diversity that we see from different nodes and clades.
Gotcha. And last question. If Moses and Abraham did not exist, if the Exodus didn't happen, would that prove your religious beliefs incorrect?
That couldn't be, it's kind of like saying someone, if the Twin Towers never fell, because we already verified the Exodus. There's an Egyptologist by the name of Frank, I'm going to say it's Dr. Frank, and he's an Egyptologist that actually did a hand-to-hand breakdown of the Israelites leaving the Avaris. And now there's a lot of people that's talking about this evidence because it's very compelling. And if someone never seen that evidence and they think it's, a generation that's born today may never know or may not heard that somehow in a couple minutes two towers fell by two planes, right? And they may say, oh, how can two towers fall by two planes in a couple minutes? Yet it happened. And we know that that's something that happened. So the Exodus is something like that, that it may sound mystical, right? That all of a sudden this nation of, remember, also Egypt was doing witchcraft and stuff. So this nation of people who are working with witchcraft and stuff were also plagued by some of the things that they couldn't even control. And obviously, if you look at some of the writings that they had, even in Egypt, they expressed that was a group that was there, Semitic group that was there, and then they left. They went to Exodus, and then all of a sudden you see writings like by Merneptah, the Merneptah Stele, that writes that Israel popped up, that they first write about Israel, and then the later processes of that. So the Exodus is confirmed.
Well, I think the consensus among all historians, including the Israelite historians, is that there's no evidence to support it. There's all the evidence indicates it's false. But my question is more generally, if it's shown to be false, would that prove your religious beliefs incorrect?
Well, my question would be, for that question, have they looked into the evidence of Dr. Falk's evidence?
Yes. But more general question, just if it's shown to be false, would that disprove religious beliefs? Not specifically about has it been shown to be false. If it was shown to be false, would that
and
cause
again
you to stop believing?
Again, the reason why I say this is like saying if 9/11 was proven to be false, would you still believe this or that? You know, it's trying to discredit something I already seen. No, I already seen the evidence. I've seen the everything's valid. I'm talking valid. If he hasn't seen that video, it'll verify it. So you can't debunk something that's confirmed. And absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. So what they'll be doing is trying to put an absence of evidence argument. But we already have the evidence. So absence of evidence won't equate or defeat the evidence. So
well, actually, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So, for example, if I said there is no water in my cup, and then I show you my cup and you don't see any water, the absence of evidence of water is evidence of the absence of water. So absence of evidence can be evidence.
But that's not what, when people say absence of evidence, that's not what they mean for that argument. When they say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that's saying that, hey, this is not here, therefore it is evident that it is not there, therefore it didn't happen. That's what they mean by absence of evidence, is that they're using the absence of evidence as evidence of absence. That's what's important.
Right. So like if there was water in the cup, you'd expect there to be dew.
Right, but that's a
wetness.
different argument for absence.
How this applies to the Exodus is that if there was a group of at minimum 500,000 people who traveled from Egypt to Jerusalem, then we would expect to see homesteads, pots.
Yeah, we do see that. We and that's what I'm saying. If you haven't seen the video by Dr. Falk, he literally goes over all those pieces of. I have seen it. Ceramic evidence.
But so we can look at the archaeological evidence of the time frame of the Promised Land and see the amount of homesteads that grew from before to after the Exodus over a period of 2,000 to 5,000 years, and at none of that is a substantial population growth ever in that time period. Not to mention that the population of the slaves of Egypt, if they were that large, would make up over 60%.
You're talking about Avaris? You talk about the Semitic groups that had a massive explosion in Avaris. We have no evidence of that.
We have no evidence of slaves leaving Egypt and then settling in Israel in that time period. No, there's zero evidence of that.
Okay, so maybe we'll do another video and I'll show you all that evidence, because we actually have evidence of Avaris emptying out, right? Avaris becoming empty. And then all of a sudden, writings of the Egyptians, of Israelites, now out of Avaris in Israel, in the land of Israel, and the movements of the conquest of Joseph. I mean, I keep getting his name twisted. Obviously, right, Moses' right-hand man, right? Not Joseph, but Joshua. And the movements of Joshua's movements, and even the kings that were pinpoint illustrated, they fall exactly at the time when as soon as the Israelites pop up in the land. And we can go to that process piece by piece, and I can show you how all that evidence is actually showed, and that the fact that the residents of those Semitic groups, right, because they're Shemites, they're Hebrew, pottery being made in the lands of Avaris, and then all of a sudden it pops up in the lands of Israel. And we can connect those things, and we can show that those were those groups that built P. Ramses and the cities that are mentioned in the Exodus that says they built those cities of Ramses in the lands of Egypt. So we can look at that. We can look at all those material evidences, and we can verify that the Israelites were there one day.
Sure, I have a few archaeologist experts who are PhDs in the field who can definitely we can talk about this with. That would be fun. But we have been going for about an hour and a half. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Yeah, if you I don't have any other sources or other connection platform, but if you want to learn a little bit more on African Israelites, definitely check out my channel on LIONFARM. Just looking at DNA, so you can put LIONFARM DNA and it should pop up on YouTube. And I just like what you're doing here, which is great, having different conversations on these different ideas, and looking at the complexity of it all.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.